Man invites his ex-girlfriend to his wedding to humiliate her, but he got shocked when the autumn wind whispered through Harvard Law School's century-old maples as Sarah Mitchell hurried across the courtyard, her arms laden with leather-bound case studies. The setting sun painted the historic buildings in hues of amber and gold, a picture-perfect moment that would forever be etched in her memory as the day her life changed irrevocably. She wasn't supposed to be in the library that evening. Her study group had cancelled, and normally she would have headed back to her small apartment in Somerville. But something, fate, destiny, or perhaps just the allure of quiet Friday evening study time, had kept her on campus. As she pushed through the heavy wooden doors of Langdale Hall, the familiar scent of aged books and polished oak enveloped her like an old friend's embrace. Sarah had worked twice as hard as anyone else to earn her place here. As one of only 12 black students in her class of hundreds, she'd felt the weight of representation on her shoulders since day one. Her father, a postal worker who'd sacrificed everything to fund her undergraduate studies, had taught her that excellence wasn't just a goal. It was armor in a world that wouldn't hesitate to judge her by the color of her skin. The library was nearly empty, save for a few dedicated souls scattered among the towering shelves. Sarah claimed her favorite spot, a secluded corner table bathed in warm lamplight, and began arranging her materials with the precision that had become her trademark. She was deep into constitutional law when a coffee cup appeared at the edge of her vision. "You looked like you could use this," said a voice, rich and warm like honey. She looked up to find James Anderson standing there, his blue eyes twinkling with something that looked surprisingly like nervousness. Sarah knew who he was. Everyone did. The Anderson name was practically royalty in Boston legal circles, their family's influence stretching back generations. "I don't accept beverages from strangers," she replied, arching an eyebrow, though a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She'd noticed him in their shared classes, had caught him looking her way more than once during discussions. "James Anderson," he said, extending his hand. "And it's just coffee from the cafe downstairs. I noticed you always order the same thing, double-shot cappuccino with an extra espresso shot." Sarah felt her professional armor crack slightly. "You've been watching my coffee orders." "I've been watching you," he admitted, a blush creeping up his neck. "You destroyed Professor Hamilton's argument about precedent in constitutional law last week. It was impressive, terrifying but impressive." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "Well, in that case—" She accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing momentarily. "Sarah Mitchell. But you probably knew that already." "I did," he confessed, shifting his weight. "Would you mind if I joined you? I'm struggling with the Jenkins case, and rumor has it you're the only one who's cracked its logic." Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her, surprising herself. She usually guarded her study time fiercely, but something about James's earnest expression and the way he spoke to her, like an equal, not a curiosity or a quota filler, made her want to break her own rules. That evening stretched into hours of passionate debate about case law, social justice, and the role of judiciary activism. James, she discovered, wasn't just another privileged legacy student. He had a sharp mind and, more surprisingly, a genuine interest in using his future career to effect positive change. When they finally noticed the time, the library was closing. As they packed up their books, James hesitated. "There's a small Italian place around the corner. Would you like to grab some dinner? We could continue our discussion about judicial reform." Sarah considered him for a moment. She knew what dating someone like James Anderson could mean. The whispers, the stares, the potential complications. But she also saw something in his eyes that spoke of sincerity, of someone willing to challenge the status quo. "On one condition," she said, shouldering her bag. "We talk about anything but law for at least the first hour." His smile lit up his entire face. "Deal." That night, over pasta and wine, they talked about everything, their families, their dreams, their fears. James spoke about the weight of family expectations, and Sarah shared stories about her father's sacrifices. They discovered a shared love for obscure jazz, terrible science fiction movies, and the Red Sox. Neither of them knew then that this was just the beginning, that their love would bloom like a rose in spring, beautiful but surrounded by thorns of societal prejudice and family expectations. They didn't know that in 3 years' time they would be standing in a very different place, their love tested by forces bigger than themselves. But for now, in that cozy restaurant corner with candles flickering and future unknowable, two souls connected over shared laughter and dreams of justice. Sarah Mitchell, who had always walked through life with careful steps and calculated moves, felt something shift in her carefully ordered world. And James Anderson, heir to a legacy he wasn't sure he wanted, found himself falling for someone who would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, courage, and doing what's right. As they walked back to their cars that night, the autumn air crisp with possibility, James reached for her hand. Sarah let him take it, their fingers intertwining as naturally as if they'd been doing it for years. Above them, the stars twinkled knowingly, witnesses to the beginning of a story that would eventually shake the foundations of Boston's elite social circles and teach lessons about love, prejudice, and the power of staying true to oneself. Little did they know that this beautiful beginning would set in motion events that would culminate in one of the most talked about almost weddings in Boston's recent history. But that was a story for another day. For now, they were just two young people falling in love, their hearts full of hope and their futures stretching out before them like an unwritten book, waiting to be filled with their shared story, hearts entwined and torn. 2 years passed like pages turning in a beloved book, each day adding new chapters to Sarah and James's love story. Their relationship blossomed despite the thorny garden of Boston's high society, where old money whispered behind crystal champagne flutes and tradition wore the mask of propriety to disguise its prejudices. Sarah's career soared at Morrison and Bennett, a prestigious civil rights firm that had practically begged for her to join after graduation. Her first year there, she won a landmark discrimination case that made national headlines. The photograph of her on the courthouse steps, fist raised in victory while surrounded by her grateful clients, earned her the nickname the Warrior of Justice among her peers. James had been there that day, beaming with pride from the crowd, his love for her evident in every glance. Meanwhile, James carved his own path at his family's firm, Anderson, Wells and Pierce, though not without internal struggle. He often found himself caught between his growing social consciousness, influenced by Sarah's passionate advocacy, and the conservative values his family had etched into his DNA. Still, they made it work. Their different worlds became less separate and more intertwined, like two streams joining to form a stronger river. Their favorite spot became a small jazz club in the South End, where the music played until dawn and nobody cared about last names or family trees. There, in the dim light and sultry saxophone notes, they could just be Sarah and James, two people in love, dancing close, dreaming of a future they would build together. But paradise began to crack during the Anderson family's annual summer gala. Eleanor Anderson, James's mother, had finally deigned to invite Sarah after months of James's insistence. The evening started pleasantly enough, with Sarah stunning in an emerald green gown that made her skin glow like polished mahogany. She handled the subtle barbs and backhanded compliments with grace, her Harvard education and professional success serving as a shield against the worst of the prejudice. The breaking point came during dinner when Eleanor, 3 martinis deep, began reminiscing about the Anderson family's historical contributions to Boston society. Her pointed comments about maintaining certain standards and preserving legacy grew increasingly difficult to ignore. When she mentioned her hopes for appropriate grandchildren, the crystal champagne glass in Sarah's hand trembled slightly, the only visible sign of her distress. James, sitting beside Sarah, said nothing. His silence echoed louder than any of his mother's words. Later that night in Sarah's apartment, the dam finally broke. "You sat there," Sarah said, her voice quiet but heavy with disappointment. "You sat there and let her demolish my dignity piece by piece. What was I supposed to do?" James ran his hands through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "Create a scene? She's my mother, Sarah. She'll come around eventually." "Eventually?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It's been 2 years, James. 2 years of eventually. 2 years of me turning the other cheek, of understanding, of being the bigger person. When does eventually become now?" The argument spiraled from there, unleashing every unspoken tension, every swallowed slight, every moment James had chosen family comfort over standing up for their love. By midnight, they were both exhausted, their words hanging in the air like smoke. After a fire, "I can't keep doing this," Sarah finally said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending that love is enough when you won't even fight for us. I won't shrink myself to fit into your family's narrow view of worth." "Sarah, please." James stepped toward her, but she held up a hand. I need you to leave. I need you to really think about what you want, James, because I know who I am, and I won't apologize for it anymore." He left that night, and something fundamentally shifted in their relationship. The following weeks became a dance of half-hearted reconciliations and deeper realizations. James, torn between his growing understanding of systemic privilege and his family's expectations, began to withdraw. Sarah, watching him retreat, felt her heart hardening like steel in a forge. The end came on a rainy Tuesday, 3 months after the gala. James arrived at her office looking like he hadn't slept in days. "My father's retiring," he said without preamble. "They're making me managing partner." Sarah knew what was coming before he said it. She could read it in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "But there are conditions," he continued, his voice hollow. "Of course there are," Sarah replied, her tone carefully neutral. "And I'm one of them, aren't I?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Get out," she whispered, then louder, "Get out!" He hesitated at the door. "I'm sorry," he said. "I really thought we could change things." "No," Sarah corrected him, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "You wanted things to change without you having to change anything. There's a difference." After he left, Sarah sat in her office until long after dark, watching the rain fall over Boston. She thought about love, about courage, about the price of staying true to oneself. That night marked the end of Sarah and James's love story, or so she thought. But fate had other plans, and the universe has a way of bringing things full circle. 3 years would pass before their paths crossed again, under very different circumstances, and by then they would both be changed people, though only one of them would be changed for the better. The invitation. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, its cream-colored luxury stock paper standing out among the stack of legal briefs on Sarah's desk like a white rose among thorns. Her assistant, Marcus, had placed it on top of her morning correspondence with a knowing look. The return address, embossed in gold leaf, bore the Anderson family crest. Sarah's fingers hovered over the envelope. 3 years had passed since she'd last heard from James. 3 years in which she'd built a reputation as one of Boston's most formidable civil rights attorneys. The corner office she now occupied at Morrison and Bennett overlooked the same harbour where she and James used to walk on Sunday mornings, dreaming of their future together. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her recent victory in a class action discrimination suit against a major corporation had made national headlines. The settlement had been substantial enough to establish a foundation supporting minority students in law school. It was the kind of case that changed lives, the kind of impact she'd always dreamed of making. With deliberate movements, she picked up her letter opener, a gift from her father when she made partner. The blade sliced through the expensive paper with a satisfying whisper. Inside, she found two items, a formal wedding invitation and a handwritten note. The invitation read, Mr. and Mrs. Theodore Anderson requests the honor of your presence at the marriage of their son, James. Theodore Anderson to Miss Victoria Elizabeth Canterbury. Saturday, the 15th of June at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, St. Mark's Episcopal Church, Boston, Massachusetts. Sarah's laugh held no humor as she noted the church, the same one where she and James had once attended Christmas service together before his family's disapproval had become too obvious to ignore. But it was the handwritten note that made her blood run cold. Dear Sarah, time has a way of putting things in perspective. These past 3 years have shown me what truly matters in life. Your presence at my wedding would mean more than I can express. Victoria has heard so much about you and your impressive achievements. She especially admires your recent work on the Fitzgerald case. I know we didn't end on the best terms, but I've grown since then. Having you there would prove that we've both moved beyond the past. Please come. It would make the day complete. Yours sincerely, James. Sarah read the note 3 times, her lawyer's mind dissecting each carefully crafted sentence. Something felt off. The James she knew, or thought she knew, had never been this calculating. She reached for her phone, scrolling through recent news articles about Anderson, Wells, and Pierce. There it was. The firm had been under fire for discrimination in their hiring practices. They'd managed to settle quietly, but the damage to their reputation lingered. Her recent high-profile victory in a similar case must have stung, especially given her history with the family. Her computer chimed with an incoming email. It was from Diana Chen, an investigative reporter she'd worked with on several cases. Sarah, thought you should see this. Screenshots from a private club meeting last week. James Anderson was there. You'll want to read the conversation about his upcoming wedding. Call me. The attached photos made her stomach turn. There was James, surrounded by his usual circle of privileged friends, bragging about inviting his activist ex to the wedding. Wait till she sees what real success looks like, he'd said. Victoria's family has real class, old money, proper breeding. It'll be the perfect reminder of why some people just don't belong in our world. Sarah leaned back in her chair, a strange calm settling over her. She thought about the young Sarah who'd fallen in love with James's smile in that library, who'd believed love could conquer generations of prejudice, that Sarah would have been crushed by this revelation. But she wasn't that Sarah anymore. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant. Marcus, clear my schedule for June 15th, and call Tom at Vogue. Remember when he wanted an exclusive about the Fitzgerald case? Tell him I'm ready to talk, but I want the story to run the week of June 15th. Next, she called her friend Carmen, the celebrated fashion designer. Remember that dress you wanted me to wear to your show, the one that made your mother-in-law clutch her pearls? Is that offer still open? Finally, she picked up a thick, cream-colored paper from her personal stationery collection. In her elegant handwriting, she penned her response. Dear James, thank you for the invitation. You're right. Time does put things in perspective. I would be honored to attend your wedding. Looking forward to celebrating with you and Victoria. Best regards, Sarah Mitchell, Esquire. Senior partner, Morrison and Bennett. As she sealed the envelope, Sarah smiled. James wanted to make a statement. She'd give him a statement he'd never forget. But first, she had some research to do about the Canterbury family and their future daughter-in-law, Victoria. Something told her there was more to this story than James realized. The sun was setting over Boston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Sarah stood at her office window, the invitation still on her desk behind her. In her reflection, she saw not the broken-hearted woman from 3 years ago, but a warrior who had learned to turn pain into power. "Game on, James," she whispered to the gathering dusk. "Game on." The wedding day. The morning of June 15th dawned with the kind of pristine clarity that wedding planners dream about. St. Mark's Episcopal Church stood majestic against the cloudless blue sky, its Gothic spires reaching heavenward like prayers cast in stone. Outside, an army of florists transformed the entrance into a cascade of white roses and silk ribbons, each bloom perfectly placed to create an illusion of effortless elegance. Sarah stood before her full-length mirror, surveying her reflection with the same critical eye she used to evaluate legal briefs. Carmen's dress was a masterpiece of subtle defiance, a deep royal blue silk that moved like water, cut to showcase her athletic figure without being inappropriate for church. The color, she knew, would stand out dramatically among the pale pastels favored by Boston society. The side slit was high enough to raise eyebrows, but not high enough to give anyone legitimate cause for complaint. "You look like a queen," Carmen said, making final adjustments to the dress's drape. "A queen who's about to go to war." Sarah smiled, touching the sapphire earrings her father had given her for making partner. "The best battles are won without lifting a sword." Her phone buzzed with a text from Diana Chen. "Stories ready. Photos authenticated. Running at noon." "You sure about this?" "Yes," Sarah typed back. "Time to let the truth speak for itself." As her driver navigated through Boston streets, Sarah reviewed what she'd learned about Victoria Canterbury over the past few weeks. The picture that emerged was fascinating, and nothing like what James or his family believed they were getting. Victoria, it turned out, was not the compliant society princess the Andersons thought they'd secured for their son. She was a quiet revolutionary in her own right, running a foundation that supported arts education in underserved communities. More intriguingly, she'd spent a year teaching in Ghana before graduate school, something her society profile conveniently omitted. The car pulled up to St. Mark's just as other guests began arriving. Sarah noticed the slight pause in conversations as she emerged, head held high. She'd chosen to arrive early, wanting to observe rather than make a grand entrance. The whispers followed her up the church steps like autumn leaves in a breeze. Inside, the church was a symphony of white and gold, with sunlight streaming through stained glass windows to create halos of colored light on the ancient stone floors. Sarah chose a seat halfway back on the bride's side, close enough to see everything, far enough to maintain perspective. Eleanor Anderson's double-take upon seeing her was almost comical. The mother of the groom recovered quickly, though her smile had all the warmth of a December frost. "Sarah, dear," she said, voice dripping with fake sweetness. "How brave of you to come." "Mrs. Anderson," Sarah replied smoothly, "the years have been kind to you." The unspoken, unlike your personality, hung in the air between them. More guests filtered in, and Sarah watched the complex social dynamics play out like a carefully choreographed dance. She recognized most of them, the power players of Boston's elite circles, the same people who'd once whispered behind her back at charity galas and country club events. But it was the arrival of Victoria's grandmother that caught Sarah's attention. Dr. Margaret Canterbury, a distinguished civil rights activist from the 1960s, walked with the aid of a cane, but carried herself with undeniable dignity. Their eyes met across the church, and the older woman gave Sarah a slight nod that spoke volumes. A rustle of excitement announced the arrival of the groom's party. James appeared at the altar, looking every inch the Boston Brahmin in his bespoke tuxedo. He scanned the crowd, his eyes finding Sarah's for a brief moment. The flash of surprise and something else. Was it fear? In his expression, confirmed that he hadn't expected her to actually come. The wedding planner hurried down the aisle, coordinating last-minute details with practiced efficiency. Sarah checked her watch, 11:55 a.m. In 5 minutes, Diana's story would go live, revealing James's true motives for inviting her. But Sarah had learned something in her years of litigation. Timing was everything, and sometimes the universe had better plans than any human could devise. The organist began the prelude, and the church fell silent in anticipation. Sarah sat back, perfectly poised, watching the door through which Victoria would soon appear. She thought about James's cruel plan to humiliate her, about Eleanor's years of subtle racism masked as tradition, about the young woman she'd been and the warrior she'd become. But mostly, she thought about Victoria, standing somewhere in the church's private chambers, preparing to walk down the aisle. Victoria, who had her own secrets, her own strength, and perhaps her own plans for this day. The clock struck noon, and Sarah's phone vibrated silently in her clutch. Diana's story was now live. But as the wedding march began to play, Sarah realized that Karma had been planning this moment long before any of them knew what was coming. The great wooden doors swung open, and a collective gasp rose from the assembled guests, but not for the reason anyone expected. The bride's entrance would become legendary in Boston society, though not for her dress or her beauty. What happened next would shake the foundations of the Anderson family's carefully constructed world, and prove that sometimes justice arrives dressed in white. The truth revealed. The wedding march echoed through St. Mark's ancient halls, but Victoria Canterbury didn't appear. Instead, her grandmother, Dr. Margaret Canterbury, rose slowly from her seat, leaning on her cane with one hand and clutching her iPad in the other. The music faltered and died. "Before my granddaughter makes her entrance," Dr. Canterbury's voice carried clearly through the hushed church, "there's something that needs to be addressed." She looked directly at James, her steel-grey eyes sharp with purpose. "Victoria asked me to share some information she received this morning." Eleanor Anderson half rose from her seat. "Margaret, surely this can wait." "It cannot." Dr. Canterbury cut her off with the authority of someone who had faced down far more formidable opponents. "James Anderson, would you care to explain these messages?" She held up her iPad, displaying screenshots of text conversations. The colour drained from James's face as his own words appeared on the church's large presentation screens, typically used for hymn lyrics during Sunday services. His messages to his groomsmen laid bare his true intentions for inviting Sarah. "Wait till she sees me with Victoria. That'll show her where she belongs. Time to remind her what she lost. Going to be epic watching her realize she never had a chance in our world." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the congregation. Sarah remained perfectly still, her face a mask of composed dignity, though her heart thundered in her chest. "But that's not all," Dr. Canterbury continued, her voice growing stronger. "Victoria has been conducting her own investigation into Anderson, Wells and Pierce's discrimination practices. As a civil rights activist myself, I taught her well." The side door opened and Victoria appeared, not in her wedding dress, but in a crisp white pantsuit. She walked down the aisle with measured steps, her head high. When she reached the altar, she turned to face the congregation rather than James. "I fell in love with a man I thought was kind, progressive and brave." Victoria's voice trembled slightly but held firm. "Instead, I discovered someone who planned to use our wedding as a weapon against a woman whose only crime was being born with different-colored skin than his family preferred." She turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, I've followed your career with admiration. Your recent victory in the Fitzgerald case inspired me to look deeper into my fiancé's firm's practices. What I found—" She paused, collecting herself. "Well, let's just say it's all been forwarded to the appropriate authorities." The tables turn. The chaos that erupted in St. Mark's was like nothing Boston society had ever seen. James lunged for Victoria, grabbing her arm. "You can't do this to me." In that moment, several things happened simultaneously. Dr. Canterbury's cane came down sharply on James's wrist, forcing him to release Victoria. Sarah was already moving, her royal blue dress flowing like water as she positioned herself between James and Victoria. And Theodore Anderson, James's father, collapsed in his seat, clutching his chest as the full implications of the exposure hit him. "Actually," Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, "she can." And she did. She turned to address the stunned congregation. "The Canterbury Foundation has been working with my firm for months, building a comprehensive case against discriminatory practices in top law firms. We just never expected it would lead us here." Victoria moved to stand beside Sarah, their shoulders aligned in solidarity. "The wedding is off," she announced, removing her engagement ring and placing it on the altar. "And I suggest everyone read the exposé that just went live about the Anderson firm's systematic discrimination. Sarah's team did an excellent job with the investigation." Eleanor Anderson's screech of rage echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "You planned this. You two worked together to destroy my family." "No, Eleanor," Sarah replied calmly. "You destroyed your family yourself, with generations of bigotry dressed up as tradition. Victoria and I never met until today. Some things are just karma." The paramedics arrived to tend to Theodore Anderson, whose crisis turned out to be just severe indigestion brought on by stress. As they wheeled him out, Victoria addressed the guests one final time. "The reception site has been informed of the cancellation. However, the venue and catering will not go to waste. Everything has been donated to the Canterbury Foundation's annual fundraiser for underprivileged law students, which will now be held there tonight." She smiled. "You're all still welcome to attend, assuming you're ready to be part of the solution rather than the problem." As the church emptied, Sarah felt a gentle touch on her arm. It was Dr. Canterbury. "When I met you at the Civil Rights Honor Ceremony last month," the older woman said with a twinkle in her eye, "I knew you were special. Thank you for giving my granddaughter the courage to follow her conscience." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You mean—" "Sometimes the universe has a better plan than we do," Dr. Canterbury smiled. "Victoria recognized you from the ceremony. She's been wanting to work with your firm for months. This wedding just provided the perfect opportunity for everything to come to light." Outside, the June sun shone brilliantly on the departing guests. Camera crews had already begun arriving, drawn by the viral spread of Diana's story. Victoria stood on the church steps, giving a composed statement about love, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. James was nowhere to be seen, having slipped out a side door with his mother. His career, like his wedding, was over before it truly began. Later, people would say the Anderson firm never really recovered from the scandal, especially after Victoria's evidence led to a federal investigation. Sarah watched it all unfold, feeling not triumph, but a deep sense of peace. She caught Victoria's eye, and they shared a knowing look. Sometimes justice came dressed in white, and sometimes it wore royal blue. But it always arrived right on time. The news crews turned their attention to Sarah, shouting questions about her involvement. But she just smiled, thinking of that young law student who once believed love could conquer prejudice. In a way it had, just not in the way she'd expected. She stepped forward to join Victoria, ready to tell their story, not one of revenge, but of redemption. not of hatred conquered by more hatred, but of justice served through truth. As the cameras flashed, Sarah realized that this wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. The consequences. The weeks following the wedding that wasn't transformed Boston's social and legal landscape like a hurricane reshaping a coastline. The Anderson family's carefully constructed empire began crumbling under the weight of revealed truths and federal investigations. Anderson, Wells and Pierce hemorrhaged clients as Victoria's evidence came to light. Decades of discriminatory hiring practices, buried settlements, and meticulously documented instances of workplace harassment spilled into public view. The firm's senior partners turned on each other like wolves in winter, each trying to salvage their own reputation at the expense of their colleagues. James disappeared to the family's summer house in the Hamptons, but couldn't escape the fallout. His text messages and emails revealing his planned humiliation of Sarah became a case study in workplace discrimination seminars. Law schools across the country incorporated the Anderson firm's downfall into their ethics curricula. Eleanor Anderson's social calendar, once the envy of Boston society, emptied overnight. Her former friends, sensing the shift in social winds, redirected their charitable donations to the Canterbury Foundation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone when several prestigious law firms, desperate to prove their commitment to diversity, began actively recruiting minority candidates and revising their hiring policies. Sarah's firm, Morrison and Bennett, experienced its own transformation. The phones rang constantly with potential clients seeking representation in discrimination cases. Sarah found herself at the helm of a newly created civil rights division, her team expanding weekly to meet the demand. But the most profound changes weren't in boardrooms or legal briefs, they were in people's hearts and minds. Young lawyers of color, inspired by Sarah's stance, began speaking out about their own experiences. The St. Mark's incident, as it came to be known, sparked a movement within the legal community, challenging the old guard's grip on power. Victoria emerged as a force in her own right. The Canterbury Foundation's fundraiser, held in place of the wedding reception, raised record-breaking amounts for minority law students. She and Sarah formed an unlikely but powerful alliance, combining the Canterbury family's influence with Sarah's legal expertise to create lasting change. 1 month after the event, Theodore Anderson requested a private meeting with Sarah. In her corner office, the once mighty patriarch looked older, diminished. "You could have destroyed us completely," he said quietly. "Why didn't you?" Sarah studied him thoughtfully. "Because destruction wasn't the goal, Mr. Anderson. Change was." New beginnings. 3 years later, Sarah stood at a podium in Harvard Law School's main auditorium, looking out at the eager faces of the graduating class. As the commencement speaker, she'd been asked to share wisdom with these future lawyers. The audience included a record number of minority students, many of them Canterbury Foundation scholars. "Justice," she began, "doesn't always wear a black robe or carry a gavel. Sometimes it arrives in unexpected ways, through unexpected people. Sometimes it looks like a wedding that never happened, or a truth that refused to stay buried." In the audience, Victoria sat beside her grandmother, both women beaming with pride. The Canterbury Foundation had become the largest private supporter of minority law students in New England. Dr. Canterbury's health had declined, but her spirit remained indomitable. James had eventually resurfaced, changed by his time away. He'd taken a teaching position at a community college in Arizona, working with first-generation college students. His letters of apology to both Sarah and Victoria spoke of hard-earned wisdom and genuine remorse. While forgiveness might still be distant, understanding had begun to take root. Eleanor Anderson, surprisingly, had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation. After months of social isolation, she had sought therapy to confront her prejudices. She now volunteered at a youth centre in Roxbury, teaching business skills to underprivileged teens. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. "Your law degrees," Sarah continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium, "are not just certificates of achievement. They are tools for change. Each of you has the power to shape not only the law, but the very fabric of our society." After the ceremony, Sarah found herself in the law library, standing in the exact spot where she had first met James all those years ago. The memory no longer hurt. Instead, it reminded her of how far she'd come, how much had changed. Victoria joined her, there carrying 2 cups of coffee. "For old time's sake," she said with a smile, handing one to Sarah. They sat at what had once been Sarah's favourite study spot, now marked with a small plaque commemorating the Canterbury Mitchell Scholarship Fund. Around them, students of all backgrounds studied together, their presence a testament to how much had changed and how much work still remained. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Victoria asked, gesturing to the diverse group of students. Sarah shook her head, smiling. "I thought I was fighting for justice in the courtroom. I never realized that sometimes the biggest changes happen in the smallest moments, in the choices we make when facing our own truths." Outside, the Boston sunset painted the sky in shades of possibility. A new generation of lawyers was preparing to take their place in the world, armed not just with knowledge of the law, but with the understanding that true justice requires both courage and compassion. The story of the wedding that never was had become a legend at Harvard Law, passed down from class to class. But Sarah knew it was more than just a cautionary tale or triumph of justice. It was a reminder that love for justice, for truth, for human dignity, really could change the world. As she and Victoria left the library that evening, they passed a young couple studying together, their differences apparent but irrelevant to their shared dreams. Sarah smiled, knowing that while some battles had been won, new ones awaited. But now at least they had help in fighting them. The future stretched out before them, not as a finished story, but as a continuing journey toward justice, understanding, and the kind of love that breaks down walls instead of building them. And that, Sarah realized, was the greatest victory of all.